Good evening. It's October 31st, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome you to our weekly webcast here from LaRouchePAC.com. I'm joined in the studio tonight by Megan Beats and Benjamin Deniston from the LaRouchePAC science team, as well as Dennis Small from Executive Intelligence Review. And the four of us have been in discussion with Mr. LaRouche over the last 24 hours. So what you hear tonight will reflect what Mr. LaRouche's view of the current situation is. Now, I would like to begin by asking our first question. And as viewers of this webcast probably know, earlier this week, Lyndon Larouche said that the threat of thermonuclear war has never been greater, and that immediate actions must be taken to jam up Obama's plans before he succeeds in launching World War III. Now, the facts on this are very clear. Poland has announced the redeployment of thousands of troops and heavy weapons to their eastern borders. The Ukrainian elections brought fascist and anti-Russian parties into significant electoral gains, immediately following which the Kiev government suddenly announced that they were withdrawing from the delineation agreement with the authorities in Donetsk. And you have the continuing escalation of the situation in Iraq and Syria. Now, Mr. LaRouche remarked yesterday that no sane and rational individual in a position of leadership would accept such a thermonuclear war being launched, since there would be no winners, only losers. It would be a mass suicide operation. Therefore, responsible parties around the globe must be mobilized to act to prevent what Obama's doing and to jam him up. And we should expect those types of actions to be taken. So, Dennis, I'd like to ask you to elaborate on what Mr. LaRouche laid out as the strategy that must be taken to jam up the Obama policy and to prevent this thermonuclear war.
Thank you. It is certainly the case that no sane and rational people in positions of responsibility in government would tolerate the prospect of a short-term thermonuclear war. One of the problems that we have is that there are insane and irrational people in positions of great power, not only in the White House of the United States, but also in the British Empire, which strategically continues to pull the strings on this international situation. Now, the developments around not only Poland and Ukraine, which Matt just mentioned, but additionally, the brewing conflagration inside the United States government around the Syria policy drew Mr. LaRouche's attention and comments over the course of the last 24 to 48 hours. What he said with regard to the war danger is that, in fact, what is behind Obama's activities is an effort to launch a concert of action to unleash war, that what was involved in the Polish and Ukrainian provocations was actually a strategic intent to strike deep into Russian territory, to weaken it, to invade it, to crush it. Now, what Mr. LaRouche commented is that this time Obama may not make it, that he's making a mistake in particular on the Syria front, on the operation to topple the Assad regime in Syria, using, among other instruments, this barbaric grouping created by the British, fostered by the Saudis, which is ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State. What Mr. LaRouche says is that the prospect of war, the approaching very real danger of thermonuclear war, has created a situation in which sane forces, both in the United States and internationally, are taking motions, taking actions to trap Obama into a defeat. And that the actions and the trap are in an area which Obama and the British Empire don't even really know exist. The way Mr. LaRouche characterized the situation is that Barack Obama's support is so thin that it's like a film of scum floating on a toilet, and that one misstep, one little trip up, and Obama is finished. Now, the key pivot in this situation, Mr. LaRouche emphasized, is Russia, and the very clear recognition by the Russian government, by President Putin and all of the top leadership of that country, of what the name of the game is. The Putin government has made it quite clear in recent statements that they are not going to tolerate the possibility of the overthrow of Assad in Syria because of what this would unleash in terms of a total regional war and a direct targeting of the Russians as well. Recall, as we've mentioned in the past on this show, that approximately half of the fighters for ISIS are in fact Chechens. Recall that the top leadership of ISIS is Chechen and has said that their intention is, number one, to seize the entire Xinjiang province of China as part of the Islamic Caliphate, and two, that their strategic objective is to overthrow the Putin government in Russia. So the Russians and the Chinese are well aware of what such an ISIS overthrow of the Assad government would mean strategically. China, Mr. LaRouche said, is also committed to preventing an outbreak of war. But what is most interesting in the immediate term is that there are, over the last couple of days, 2-3 days, and going into this weekend, growing indications that in the United States there are forces in motion that intend to screw up Obama's war plan. Mr. LaRouche referred to this as a kind of committee of influence to bar war. And there are, in fact, very deep policy differences within the Obama administration and outside the Obama administration, but in positions of power as well in Washington, in particular over the Syria question, and in particular over the fact that American policy and British policy heretofore has in fact created and strengthened the ISIS barbarians. So we see some interesting reflections of this, for example, in the fact that around the battle over Kobani, the United States military has in fact deployed to make sure that, at least so far, ISIS is not victorious in seizing control over Kobani. There are also, as well, as many of our viewers will be aware, press accounts of very big fights going on inside the Obama administration over how to deal with this crisis on the Syrian front. Secretary of Defense Hagel reportedly wrote a 2-page memorandum to the White House. The contents of it are not known, except that he questioned, what in the hell are we doing in Syria? What is our policy? Are we for or against overthrowing Assad? What are we doing on the ISIS question? And less significant than the particular position that Hagel may or may not have adopted is the fact that this is a brawl inside the administration. So much so that even Obama himself, with his Harvard degrees and all, had to admit before the cameras a few days ago that, yes, his policies were contradictory. There were contradictions in his policy on Syria involving a contradictory area with contradictory changes going on. In other words, the guy's irrational and insane, and his policy is suicidal. That's the actual translation of what he said. Now, what Mr. LaRouche emphasized, that over the next few days, over the course of this weekend and the coming days of the beginning of the week, we have the following situation. If Putin moves, as he has, on the strategic front, and this is a subject we will deal with in a little more depth a few moments ahead in this broadcast. If China also blocks the war drive in Syria, as is their stated commitment, and if U.S. military layers also act to prevent an ISIS takeover of that country, then we are in a position, Mr. LaRouche said, to screw up the enemy's entire war plan. And he emphasized that the essence of strategy in a delicate, fast-moving situation like this, that strategy is not based on forces and numbers and arithmetic and counting up this and that and the other. Strategy is based on breaching the enemy's ranks where he didn't even know he had a vulnerability, where he was overconfident, where he expected there would be no resistance on a policy front. That's where he gets jammed up. And Mr. LaRouche specified, don't try to use an adding machine to figure this out. Arithmetic does not apply when you're dealing with human behavior, and strategy and warfare are human behavior. He said what you have to do is you have to screw things up for the enemy. You have to make sure he slips on a banana peel that he didn't even know existed. He said that's strategy, and timing is of the essence in this. Because if we can actually jam up this drive towards war, this gallop towards war, which itself is driven by the breakdown of the international financial system and the desperation of the British Empire to submit the planet to its genocidal policies. If you can jam that up at one point, it does not have to be at every point, then you create a situation where the forces that are in motion around a contrary policy, in fact, more than a contrary policy, an entirely new paradigm for humanity, a paradigm that understands that human behavior is not characterized by arithmetic, by a higher concept. What the BRICS countries have set in motion and what has been the leadership of the LaRouche movement internationally for many, many decades, this type of global paradigm shift can bring into existence, as if overnight, a mass movement which will be able to turn the tide. So that's the approach to the immediate circumstances that the United States and the world are in over this coming weekend, and how we can use this circumstance to do what's absolutely critical: remove Barack Obama from the White House by constitutional means to totally transform the strategic situation.
Now, Dennis cited what Vladimir Putin did specifically last week in his speech to the Valdez Club. And what he said there was very calculated, very well timed, and much more explicit than he's ever been before. He started this speech by stating that he was going to speak the truth directly and honestly, contrary to what is conventionally done in diplomatic settings. And then he proceeded to identify precisely what the game is that Obama and the British Empire are attempting to play. I want to just read a few short passages from his speech. Putin said the following: "International law has been forced to retreat over and over by the onslaught of legal nihilism. Objectivity and justice have been sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. Arbitrary interpretations and biased assessments have replaced legal norms. At the same time, total control of the global mass media has made it possible, when desired, to portray white as black and black as white." Putin continued, "The very notion of national sovereignty has become a relative value for most countries. In essence, what has been proposed is the formula: the greater the loyalty towards the world's sole power center, the greater this or that ruling regime's legitimacy. The measures taken against those who refuse to submit are well known and have been tried and tested many times. They include use of force, economic and propaganda pressure, meddling in domestic affairs, and appeals to a kind of supra-legal legitimacy when they need to justify illegal intervention in this or that conflict or toppling inconvenient regimes. Of late, we have increasing evidence, too, that outright blackmail has been used with regard to a number of leaders. It is not for nothing that Big Brother is spending billions of dollars on keeping the whole world, including its own closest allies, under surveillance." Putin said, "Let us ask ourselves, how comfortable are we with this? How safe are we? How happy living in this world, and how fair and rational has it become? A universal diktat and imposing one's own models produces the opposite result. Instead of settling conflicts, it leads to their escalation. Instead of sovereign and stable states, we see the growing spread of chaos. And instead of democracy, there is support for very dubious persons ranging from open neo-fascists to Islamic radicals." Now, what Putin did with this speech is he identified the situation, as Dennis mentioned, in Syria directly. And he described it in very precise terms. He said, "In Syria, as in the past, the United States and its allies started directly financing and arming rebels and allowing them to fill their ranks with mercenaries from various countries. Let me ask, where do these rebels get their money, their arms, and military specialists? Where does all of this come from? how did the notorious ISIL manage to become such a powerful group, essentially a real armed force? Russia warned repeatedly about the dangers of unilateral military actions, intervening in sovereign state affairs, and flirting with extremists and radicals. We insisted on having the groups fighting the central Syrian government, above all the Islamic State, included on the lists of terrorist organizations. But did we see any results? We appealed in vain. Now, I would just draw our viewers' attention to the opening clip from LaRouche's 1999 broadcast, Storm Over Asia, that we played during one of these webcasts a few weeks back. And I ask you to compare what Putin said in this speech about the mercenaries that have been deployed directly from against sovereign nations in this region. I ask you to compare those statements to what Lyndon Larouche said in 1999 in his Storm Over Asia broadcast. Now, what Putin concluded his speech with was by stating that the only way of preventing world war and global anarchy is by establishing a new system of mutual cooperation and development, citing the BRICS and the SCO by name, and stating that these types of joint economic projects and mutual investments serve to bring countries closer together and to smooth out problems between relations between states. And he also pointed out that these types of joint integration projects help drive the domestic development of countries as well. So I think it's very clear that Putin's speech to the Valdez Club was a very calculated and well-timed decision to identify exactly what Obama and the British are up to, and is an act of sabotaging their strategy by merely identifying exactly what their strategy is, detonating their own game in their face, in a sense. So, Dennis, what I'd like to ask you is, can we see this as part of the broader institutional actions among world leaders now to jam up Obama's drive for thermonuclear war?
Yeah, sure. Lyndon Larouche over the years has identified, until fairly recently, only 3 countries in the world that actually think like global powers, i.e. think in terms of their policy affecting and shaping the entire planet. Some for good and some for evil, depending. One clearly is the United Kingdom, the British Empire. Another is the United States of America. And another has been Russia. All of these for different historical reasons, cultural reasons, which I won't get into at this point. But I think it's also clearly, manifestly the case that over the recent period, China has joined the ranks of those countries, those cultures, in the case of China, bringing to bear a 5,000-year history, and in particular its Confucian philosophy and culture, and is thinking and acting globally. Now that, by way of prelude to answering your question, let's take a look at the panorama, in particular those 4 corners of the earth that I just mentioned. In the case of Russia, as the Putin-Valdez speech makes abundantly clear, as the saying goes, Russia knows what time it is. Not only Putin's speech, but after it this week, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, on a visit to Belarus, talked about the need for additional military maneuvers between the 2 countries because of changes going on their borders, which clearly has the name, rank, and serial number of the Polish and Ukrainian developments in mind. In addition to that, the Russians over the course of this week carried out some very significant military maneuvers, including the launching of an SLBM, a submarine launched ballistic missile, from the Barents Sea to a target in Kamchatka Peninsula. This was the first time that this Bulava missile was tested not in a developmental stage, but actually in a war deployment stage. In other words, they are ready to go, and they are making it clear that they are not going to simply throw in the towel on the strategic situation. Also of really great interest this week was the interview given by the former Prime Minister of Russia, Yevgeny Primakov, on the occasion of his 85th birthday, after he was visited at his home by Putin, and they drank a cup of tea together and chatted, and he was also celebrated by Foreign Secretary Lavrov of Russia as a great figure. Primakov referred to the fact that the economic sanctions being imposed on Russia today are a form of a color revolution, to trigger a color revolution. And of course, people should recall that the Strategic Command of Russia and China, at a conference earlier this spring in Moscow, had identified color revolutions being launched by the West as a form of warfare, actual warfare. So the Russians are very clear, like I said, what time it is and what's at stake here. Primakov had some very other interesting remarks on the question of it's time for Russia to use its reserves for credit issuance for development in high technology. He also suggestively talked about the importance of informal diplomacy at a time like this to make sure that problems are actually resolved. And I think it's worth our listeners recalling that the last time the United States and Russia had reasonable relations, cooperative relations, was back in the 1998-99 period when Primakov was prime minister and when Clinton was president of the United States. And it was a direct deployment by the British to make sure that Primakov was removed from office, and so forth. So the Russians are very clear on what's at stake here, and it is one of the factors in gumming up the works, jamming things up for Obama. Another crucial element is China in terms of its strategic thinking, and we could spend an entire program and then some discussing what the Chinese are doing. But I want to just draw people's attention to one recent statement by Major General Peng Guangqian on September 15th at the Beijing Chinese Cultural Exchange and Promotion Association, where he was discussing the recent militarily aggressive tone of Japanese behavior towards China. And what he said is the following, quote, "As it shifts its global strategy eastward, and because of its need to contain China, the U.S. once again disregards international morality, purposefully released Japan's strategic capability, and lets it out of the cage. This offers the opportunity for the militarism, which has been dormant for more than half a century, to come back to life." Close quote. So they're clearly looking at the regional difficulties with Japan through the prism of the strategic situation and the identification of the aggressive policy coming from the Obama administration. So I think it's safe to say that China, too, knows what time it is. What about Washington? Does Washington know what time it is? Well, some people do. And I'll leave that image of the time for my colleague Ben Deniston to address from a more substantive point a little bit ahead, but just the common sense expression of knowing what time it is. Do people have any idea of what's actually going on? Well, I think a good microcosm of this was actually the fight going on was on full display this week at a conference in Washington, D.C., which was the 23rd Annual Arab-U.S. Policymakers Conference. And at this event, there was a presentation given by Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who is a veteran diplomat, retired military, decades of experience in the region, and so on. And what he did is he identified the U.S. invasion of Iraq as having been absolutely decisive for blowing the whole region up into a crisis that it has not yet recovered from. And in fact, American policy has continually been bad since that point, he stated. And of course, that was done under the Tony Blair influence over the Bush government in the first period. But what Ambassador Freeman said, one small quote from his speech, was, "The U.S. invasion of Iraq kicked off an orgy of intolerance and sectarian killing that has now taken at least 700,000 lives in Iraq and Syria and traumatized both, while threatening the existence of the other states created by Sykes-Picot a century ago." Now, after Ambassador Freeman spoke, the floor was given to present the side of Satan in this debate to Prince Turki bin Faisal. Prince Turki bin Faisal was the head of Saudi intelligence in the run-up to 9/11. He is the brother of the current foreign minister of Saudi Arabia. And he delivered a very aggressive, nasty speech accepting no questions afterwards, but storming out after his presentation. And what he said is the entire problem in the whole region is the failure of the United States administration to date to topple and overthrow the Assad regime in Syria, as the United States had contributed, he said rightly, to the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So he said what the United States should be doing at this point is launching airstrikes to overthrow Assad. And he then launched a tirade against those who point the finger at the Saudis at a purported Saudi role in supporting ISIS, which of course he had just done to all effects and purposes. And he urged people, anyone who was pointing the finger at Saudi Arabia, to either put up or shut up. Well, I agree. The easiest way to put up, because we are not going to shut up, is by releasing the 28 pages which have been censored and kept out of public view by the Bush administration and now by the Obama administration from the congressional inquiry into 9/11, which point unmistakably to the Saudi role, and I would say under British sponsorship, in unleashing that terrorist attack on American soil. And that would help put things in the proper focus so that in the United States, we can quickly get the shift that we need immediately so that those who know what time it is actually get the upper hand. That combination, Russia, China, the United States in particular, and other forces, is exactly what's required, as LaRouche said, to gum up the works, to screw things up for the Obama administration and be enough to be the little push that pushes it over the edge.
Thank you. Now I'd like to read our institutional question for the evening. It reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, your war plan for defeating Ebola has been widely circulated and discussed within leading policymaking circles in Washington and has significant support. In this document, you call for 5 specific measures that must be taken immediately. The establishment of an international steering committee to coordinate anti-Ebola efforts, a Berlin airlift-style mobilization to bring the adequate supplies to the hot zones in West Africa, the deployment of hospital ships to the region to provide adequate beds, the launching of a global Manhattan Project to develop and mass-produce a vaccine, and the preparation of preemptive plans to allow immediate detection and treatment of new cases of Ebola outside the current hot zone, with Hill-Burton equivalent standards of public health infrastructure and delivery established worldwide. Given the immediacy and urgency of the actions that you call for, can you further elaborate on the priority measures that you believe must be taken right away to actually win this fight?
Yeah, just very briefly on this, as the statement that has been published explains quite specifically, in addition to these measures on Ebola per se, the key to the success of implementing these policies is to get rid of the even worse virus occupying the White House, which is Barack Obama. The entirety of Obamacare must be eliminated, and President Obama has to be removed from the White House. Otherwise, the main obstacle to implementing these other measures will not actually proceed. And it's not really surprising to us that this policy proposal has gotten some traction, and people are looking at this carefully in many quarters in the United States, in Washington and elsewhere, because there has to be an approach to this thing which is otherwise going to spread very rapidly globally and affect the United States. Whatever people may say in terms of the public relations part of the campaign, oh, you can't get this unless, you sit next to someone for 12 hours while they are vomiting or something like that. It is well known scientifically that this is in fact highly contagious, and the CDC itself has said that it can be communicated by droplets, aerosol droplets from sneezing and so on, even if those are deposited on doorknobs and so on and so forth. The point is, this is an epidemic moving towards a pandemic which can make the entire human species extinct. And it implies something even more profound in this whole question. And I'd like to draw people's attention to the comments made by the head of the Office of the World Health Organization in Berlin, who earlier this week said, well, yes, we should get all of this aid to West Africa on the Ebola question, absolutely. But if we don't also provide food to people, the people who are saved from Ebola are going to starve to death. And that's really true. And it draws a broader point here, which is there's two features of the Ebola crisis which are less discussed and people feel more uncomfortable with, but I want to emphasize them. Number one, this policy is intentional. I don't mean necessarily, although I also don't rule it out, that it could have been cooked up in some British laboratory and deliberately infected various countries. I don't rule that out, but that's not what I mean. It doesn't take that. All that's required, as in the case of the 14th century Black Death, is to create the physical economic circumstances of reduction of mankind's energy flux density and his capability to develop the biosphere around him. That's all that it takes to create the circumstances in which the British policy of mass depopulation and genocide, of reducing the world's population from 7 billion down to 1 billion, which is the stated policy going back from Malthus and before and through Bertrand Russell and through Prince Philip and so on and so forth, that policy is actually implemented in the form of creating the economic conditions, the physical economic conditions, under which something like the Ebola virus runs rampant. And if it isn't Ebola, it will be something else unless we reverse that economic policy. So that's one feature of this that I think needs to be stressed. There's no quick fix. The entire world paradigm must be changed. And that's the crucial question before us on the table. The second feature of this is that doing so actually requires an entirely different approach to the science of mankind, to the science of the biosphere, and most importantly, the science of the noosphere, along the lines of what the great Russian biogeochemist Vladimir Vernadsky laid out. That you have in the biosphere and the noosphere, which is man's control over that realm of merely living matter, but we as the creative part of that, the willfully creative part of that living matter, are in a position where we must, through our creative and scientific advances, guarantee an advance of man's power over that entire biosphere. When we fail to do that, what you see is not evolution, but devolution. And there's no middle ground on this thing. And every time that mankind has not done this, has collapsed into arithmetic thinking as opposed to creative thinking, what you get is what we are now seeing and what we saw in the 14th century. And today, as in the 14th century, the answer and the solution lies in the realm of that which distinguishes man from animals, in creativity, in science, in classical culture. And that's the actual issue posed by the Ebola crisis today.
So, Dennis, so far this evening, you've addressed the danger which is immediately before us all of the outbreak of World War III at the hands of Obama and the British, and also the actions underway on the part of President Putin and others, along with certain circles in the United States, perhaps, to jam up the works of this British Obama policy and to attempt to avert such a tragedy for mankind. Now, not at all disconnected from this, we see something else rising before us, which is the coming into being of a new paradigm for mankind, a new system of relations among nations for the mutual benefit and the mutual development of all. This is, as we've discussed, pivoting around the leadership of the BRICS formation, along with the nations of South America, Mexico, and so forth. Now, as was reported on this broadcast last week by Jason Ross, this new paradigm was exhibited very powerfully at the 30th anniversary conference of the Schiller Institute, at which Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche was the keynote speaker, which was held 2 weekends ago in Frankfurt, Germany. The conference was entitled The New Silk Road and China's Lunar Program. One of the speakers at that conference, Mr. Xi Zhe, a senior fellow at the Chinese Institute of International Studies, commented in his speech I had been at so many conferences about the One Road, One Belt in China, but this is the first time for me to participate in this kind of conference abroad. I am honored to be here to share the idea with different scholars here. One Belt and One Road introduces a new era with a grand conception of deepening China's cooperation with the outside world and embodies China's new concept of international cooperation. Perceiving future development, the question of bringing together domestic interests and internal development with the interests and development of our neighboring countries in a system of worldwide development and mutual progress raises urgent questions with regard to our concept and practice of innovative development. Now, another speaker from China at that conference, Mrs. Pei Hua of the China Songqing Ling Foundation, which is the foundation which had sponsored Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche at an important conference which had occurred in August along the ancient Silk Road. In her speech, she commented, "Now, in mid-October, less than 2 months after Madame Helga Zepp-LaRouche's visit to China, the Schiller Institute is holding the conference on the new Silk Road and China's lunar program in celebration of its 30th anniversary, which will bring together the world, Germany, and China, match ideas to music, and link classics with modernity. A highlight of the 30 years' excellence of the Schiller Institute, this conference represents how Madame Zepp-LaRouche connects her deep thinking on human development with her China Silk Road experience, and also continues the bond between the Schiller Institute and China Songqing Ling Foundation, forged through the Silk Road." Now, coming off of this conference, on October 24th, an interview with Mrs. LaRouche was published in the Chinese language paper, the European Times, which states quite explicitly that, quote, "In Germany, the Schiller Institute, founded 30 years ago, called for the establishment of the Eurasian Continental Bridge and the World Land Bridge. China's Silk Road economic belt and the Schiller Institute ideas coincide." So, what I think the average and most Americans very likely do not understand is that these two individuals, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, have played a central role in orchestrating over decades what we're now seeing manifest today in the active emergence of this new world system for mankind, which is obviously indicated by these few comments that I read from China. So, Dennis, I'd ask you to please comment.
Yeah, sure. There's two issues here. One is the actual reality of Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche's role in this global movement, which is now, in fact, the dominant force in half of mankind, the BRICS movement. The other thing which I'd like to just mention and make sure people are aware of is that Americans are really blind as to what causes things to happen in the world and in the United States, not to exclude other countries and other people from also being blind. But the United States, Americans really have this terrible problem of pragmatism and practicality of looking at what's immediately before their nose, and if it isn't there, if they can't touch it, feel it, smell it, or whatever it, and sometimes the whatevering it gets to be a little problematic and they get into trouble with the law. But if that's not what they experience through their direct sense perception, they kind of rule it out of existence and say, well, or if they didn't see it in the media, even though everyone knows that the media does nothing but lie, people nonetheless look at the media for what they think actually occurred. The simple fact of the matter is that it's very useful for people to look at the United States and look at people in the United States, like Mr. LaRouche, through the eyes of foreigners, not because what those foreigners see is necessarily the full reality, but it is a really useful antidote to the pragmatism which we experience so much in our country. Now, in that regard, I think the quote that you mentioned from the European Times article on Helga Zepp-LaRouche is it gives you a very good idea. This is a major newspaper in Chinese, which is published to present the views of what the Chinese government is up to. And what it states, very matter-of-factly, is that the views of the Schiller Institute on the Silk Road, which is the stated policy of President Xi Jinping of China, representing 1.75 billion people, however many it is, that policy originated with Helga Zepp-LaRouche 30 years ago in the Schiller Institute, and that it does coincide, is the word that they use, it coincides with the stated policy of the Chinese government. Rather significant. Similarly, in the case of Russia, I had the opportunity to speak on Mr. LaRouche's behalf earlier this week at an event held in Moscow by internet hookup, which was the Zinoviev dialogue, the Zinoviev readings, which is a yearly event in which Alexander Zinoviev, who is a prominent philosopher and political figure in Russia, now deceased, and one of the leading figures in RIA Novosti, the press agency of Russia, one of their TV anchors, very well known by the name of Dmitry Kiselyov, co-sponsored this organization. And this was their annual event, which was a dialogue on economic and philosophical issues at the time. But independent of the content of the event, what was most important was the way that they referred to Mr. Lyndon Larouche, because in the introductory remarks given by Dr. Iskander Valitov of the Zinoviev Institute, what he said was, and I quote, "Lyndon Larouche is someone well known and respected in Russia. He is one of those scholars who is uncompromising and has experienced a difficult fate," a reference to the fact that Mr. Larouche went to jail under the Bush administration. And Valitov continued, "He experienced a difficult fate who takes his stand on such positions of knowledge and does not fear to speak the truth," close quote. And then at the conclusion of the event, in expressing their thanks to Mr. LaRouche and sending their regards to him and so on, Olga Zinoviev, the co-sponsor of the event, the widow of Alexander Zinoviev, who incidentally, along with her late husband, had both signed a letter that was circulating internationally at the time, at the end of the 1980s, demanding the release and exoneration of Mr. LaRouche and those political prisoners who were incarcerated with him, of which I was incidentally one. So I very much appreciated the fact that I was in touch finally with people who had been supportive of Mr. LaRouche at that time. So Olga Zinoviev said in closing, "Please convey my most heartfelt greetings to Mr. LaRouche and appreciation of his steadfastness and the firmness and consistency of his position. Very great thanks to his wife, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, as well." So what you see is that in these two major powers of the BRICS nations, they look to Mr. LaRouche and to Mrs. LaRouche, to what LaRouche represents in the United States, what the Schiller Institute represents internationally, as those forces outside the BRICS nations per se, which are the potential allies to make this whole project feasible and workable. And this is, of course, Mr. LaRouche's clearest stated intent. We must get the United States on board with this policy approach that we see in the BRICS, and in particular that China and Russia are leading forward with in terms of economic development. So if you look at the United States through their eyes, put yourself for a moment in the position of someone in the Kremlin looking at the United States with these threats coming from the Obama administration, or in the case of China, looking at this effort to surround them. Think of Putin's words at Valdai. Think of this Chinese general and his remarks. And as they survey the political landscape of the United States, it's pretty obvious what importance they would ascribe to the ideas and the political movement of LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche in the United States, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche internationally. Because it is that factor of change, that little push, that can tip this whole thing over the edge, as Mr. LaRouche was discussing in the case of Obama. And that's how this international situation is actually put together. Another situation in terms of how this has been developing is that of Brazil. earlier this week, on Sunday, in fact, in the second round elections, the British got their comeuppance because they had expected to get at least one of their candidates elected president of Brazil. And instead, despite all of their efforts, current President Dilma Rousseff, committed to the policy of the BRICS, was reelected. And the British really got very upset about this. In fact, The Economist magazine published an article called Die Hard Dilma, which I think more than anything else means that their attempts to destroy her haven't been so easy. And they state very clearly that she had damn well better change her policy or else. But it's of note that in the Brazilian situation, in the final week of campaigning, people in Brazil who are supporting the Rousseff campaign, in particular, a very important article was published in Jornal do Brasil, or JB as it's referred to down there, which is the third oldest paper in Brazil. It's a very prominent, well-read newspaper, republished almost intact the analysis of Mr. LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review magazine on what being at stake in the Brazil elections was the British plan for depopulation and financial looting versus the BRICS policy, as Mr. LaRouche had expressed this view. So, again, a kind of case of playing the LaRouche card in this circumstance. In this whole international collection of forces, it's important to mention not just China, Russia, as we have, what Brazil has been doing. China has been very active this last week, by the way. I mean, we could tick off a number of things that they've been doing, but President Xi Jinping spoke with President Cristina Kirchner of Argentina in terms of ongoing cooperation between those countries. Argentina has just announced that they are making use of the first tranche of the $11 billion swap line that was set up between the two countries to protect Argentina from financial warfare from the vulture funds. Then you also have the case of Mexico, which is being pulled into the fold of the BRICS, and the development outlook inherent in that, in the upcoming trip of Mexican President Peña Nieto to China for the APEC meeting and also for a state visit with China, where one of the projects that will be signed is a very major strategic one of building a high-speed rail corridor across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico, connecting two superports on each side of Coatzacoalcos on the Gulf side and Salina Cruz on the Pacific side, which the Chinese are going to finance. And this is of great importance, especially because Mexico had been pulled into the United States, Obama, IMF drug circuit in the most dramatic of ways since 2009. And this in a country which has played a very important role for fighting historically for sovereign national development. So although there were rumors over the last day or two that Peña Nieto was going to be canceling his China trip, in fact, it is not the case. He has merely shortened the trip somewhat. And reliable sources in Mexico have told us that the Mexican government has come under major pressure from the White House directly to cancel the China trip. And as of now, they have not done so. The Pope is another very important factor in this global grouping of forces in terms of his meetings with, for example, the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, and the role that Bolivia has played along with the BRICS nations, and so on and so forth. But the bottom line here is that what you have is a coalition of forces that have come together, built around not only development projects, of which there are many, not just a new development bank, which has begun to come into existence to replace this monetary order, but around a concept of man which is totally different than that in the transatlantic sector, totally different than the idea that what governs man is simply personal satisfaction and pleasure. And this is where the enemy really miscalculates. This is the area where arithmetic doesn't apply. This is the area of the banana peel that these guys don't even know exists, because they actually misjudge what it is that moves man and nations. They truly think that it is the hedonistic calculus of Bentham, and that if you can just add enough chips on the sides of hedonistic pleasure in the form of money, or if you can just add enough threats on the sides of pain, like I'm going to kill you or overthrow your government, that that's what rules. And they're wrong. It rules with some people, but it is not what man is in his essence. Man in his essence is a creative being capable of not only creativity, but love of mankind that accompanies that creativity. And there is absolutely no reason in the world that we should not have a global culture governed by the idea, as the president of China has stated, in terms, cultural terms and so forth, appropriate for that society. But it is something which is universal in man. There is no reason that what should guide us is the idea of the benefit of the other. The idea is not stoicism and self-sacrifice and suffering so that somebody else will do well. It's the idea that what is in my most immediate benefit is the welfare of my entire species, because we are a species based on creativity and on love, and we are not a species based on Bentham's hedonistic calculus. And that's our ultimate weapon. That's the banana peel with which we're going to get rid of Obama.
I think that's the perfect context to introduce Ben Deniston as the final speaker in tonight's broadcast. Just by way of introduction, I'd like to emphasize to our viewers that Ben has just authored a new report titled Science for a New Paradigm, Time for a Solar Noosphere, which is the latest in a series of papers that he's been working on as part of what I think could be called the Vernadsky Project with other members of the LaRouche PAC science team. This was presented during the weekly New Paradigm show earlier this week. Also, if you were on the LaRouche PAC activist call last night, Ben was a speaker. Just to note, Ben dedicates this paper to the recently concluded very successful conference, which Megan Beats referred to, on the 30th anniversary of the Schiller Institute. And he says in the introduction that the rise of the new strategic alliance on the planet, which is centered around the BRICS, with this comes the potential for a scientifically valid conception of the creative nature of mankind to govern the planet and beyond. And Ben notes that what he endeavors to investigate in this paper are some of the scientific aspects of this prospective new stage for mankind, starting from the recent emphasis by Lyndon Larouche that the animal conception of mankind must be eliminated and replaced with a scientific understanding of the creative powers of the human mind. The specific subject here is an initial investigation of animal versus human time. So I'd like to invite Ben to come to the podium to make a few remarks on this.
Thanks, Matthew. As you said, I mean, the article was prompted by Mr. LaRouche's continued emphatic insistence on the importance of this issue, and specifically the issue of mankind versus animal. And as viewers of this broadcast, I'm sure know, he has said that this is one of, if not the most important issues to be dealt with by mankind. And it can be, to some people, it might seem like a simple question even. I mean, some people might look at it very simply. Say, I don't act like an animal. My friends don't act like animals. I don't sniff the rear end of my friends. So what's the big deal? You know, I'm not an animal. Or on the flip side, you might have an academic who says, yes, we are all animals, and that's why I sniff the rear end of my associate next door. But the question is, what's the real scientific basis of the distinction? Well, not just these simple concepts, but how do you come to a scientific, positive conception of the difference? What is it about mankind that makes mankind different from an animal? Not just what is it that mankind doesn't do that animals do, but what is it that mankind does that makes mankind mankind? And for today, and as Matt referenced, for the prospect of a new paradigm for the entire planet, the most important work, I think, on this issue comes from the scientific work of Mr. LaRouche himself, what he's worked on intensively for the past decades. and as he's emphasized, the work of Vladimir Vernadsky. So just to flesh this out a little bit, I wanted to start by just looking at Vernadsky's work, and start with Vernadsky's work on animal life, because it kind of gives us an important basis to look at this issue of human life. Now, Vernadsky himself was emphatic that in studying animal life, we're not just looking at an individual animal or even an individual species. He says we're not just interested in looking at what does this thing do, how big is it, what is its morphology, what does it look like. We want to ask, what does it do to the environment? And not just for one animal, what does life as a whole do to the environment? Which is a very different question than the way most biologists or scientists take the question today. You don't just study the living organism itself as you observe it with your sense perceptions. You ask, what is the power of living matter, as Vernadsky would call it, or life as a whole on the planet, to the planet as a whole? And two things were clear from Vernadsky's work of his study of life, of animal life. One, life is the most powerful force shaping the surface of the planet. The soils, the atmospheres, the oceans, the surface of the planet as a whole is determined and controlled by life. Life is the determining force. And secondly, over evolutionary time, over millions of years, the power for life to do this has been consistently increasing. What we would today call, in Mr. LaRouche's terms, the energy flux density of life, of the biosphere, is increasing. And Vernadsky himself identified this as the core principle governing evolution, what he called his second biogeochemical principle, which again is not looking at the effect of one species per se, but if you look at the effect of the transition between species to the development of new species, more advanced species, this is characterized by an increasing energy flux density of the biosphere as a whole, an anti-entropic process on the planet. So this was some of Vernadsky's work. And against this backdrop of what do we actually know about animal life on this planet, Vernadsky then posed the study of human life. And he identified very clearly that the activity of human society by these metrics of animal life immediately surpasses the power of any animal species we know of. That if this is our understanding of life, and you look at the human being as a living organism, but then you study the effect of the human being from the standpoint of this similar analysis, studying the effect of animal life, we immediately see a complete difference. That the power of mankind immediately moves beyond anything measured by any other simple animal species. And beyond that, mankind increases the energy flux density of the biosphere as a whole. And on a scale you might otherwise only see something approximating that on the course of evolutionary time, with the transition between generations of animal species. But mankind does this in generations, not in millions of years. In effect, mankind, in one sense, wields the power of biological or geological or evolutionary time on the scale of mere generations. But mankind does not do this by any biological change or biological process. It's the power of scientific and creative thought that enables mankind to do this. And this is what Vernadsky discussed explicitly. Vernadsky wrote on the subject of scientific thought as a geological force. It is human scientific thought which is the source of this capability for mankind to increase the energy flux density of the planet as a whole. And this has some very clear parallels with Mr. LaRouche's work himself in his science of physical economics, studying the power of mankind to increase the potential relative population density of the human species, to increase the productive powers of labor of any working individual, to increase the power of an economy, of a society, to produce more goods than it produced before at a higher quality to sustain a higher population. But as Mr. LaRouche very emphatically, and as Vernadsky as well understood, that these physical expressions are merely shadows of this creative mental action of the mind, of human individuals, and of the cultural process of society, which is the source for mankind of this ability to create this physical change on the planet. So if we're talking about mankind and we're talking about the planet today, it is the actions of the human mind and only the human mind which bound and govern entire sweeps of history, and bound and govern what are the equivalent of entire geological scale processes on the planet. It's a kind of, you could call it a creative mental fabric which now governs the planet as a whole. So if we're scientifically talking about what is mankind, what makes mankind different than an animal, we have to realize mankind is not measured by any metrics of the animal domain. Even less so, as Mr. Larouche continually emphasizes, even less so by any metrics of sense perception, of sense perceptual space or time. That man is not measured by the biological lifespan of any individual. So it is the creative actions of the human mind which determine the metrics for mankind, for society. And this is something that Mr. Larouche emphasized in his policy document for an economic recovery for the United States a few months back, that mankind has 4 laws to save the nation, that for mankind, it is mankind that determines his own metrics. But I think the point to emphasize, which I wrote about in the article, that I think is what needs to be put up front and fought with today for people, is that these are not just opinions. This is not an opinion of Mr. Larouche, not just a thesis of Vernadsky, but these are scientific conceptions and scientific considerations. That the individual in society has to see themselves from the standpoint of this scientific reality. That this action, this non-biological domain of measure of the actions of the human mind is what is true. That's where your true existence lies. Not in your biological lifespan, not in your sense perceptual experience. And so from this standpoint, as we've emphasized and as Mr. Larouche has emphasized, we're now looking at the prospect of moving out into the solar system from this standpoint. And very briefly, I think it's worth posing that I think Vernadsky himself, if he were alive today, would look at this question with an intense amount of interest, specifically from the standpoint of his conception of the noosphere. And looking at the fact that we're now sitting on the prospect of the transition to a completely new stage, transitioning beyond just a terrestrial noosphere, a noosphere limited to the planet itself, into the potential domain of a solar noosphere, of the power of the human mind to begin to control and organize the solar system. And this is not an issue of just placing certain people in certain objects and locations. It's not putting a spacecraft here or a person there. Those are shadows, those are effects. But the issue is for mankind to become the governing principle of the solar system itself, as mankind today is the governing principle of the entire planet. Now, admittedly, that's a very long-term process, but the point is that that's the conception that we need to start with right now. And we have to see mankind, even though we haven't completed this process, and it's a long way to completing it, we have to see mankind and every individual member of the human species from the standpoint of this reality, this perspective. And so I encourage people to look at the paper that I put out under direct provocation from Mr. Larouche on the subject, and we will continue to have more on this subject of developing this scientific basis for where mankind must go.
Thank you very much, Ben. And the text of Ben's report is available on the LaRouche PAC website. And as Ben mentioned, I would encourage everyone who hasn't yet to study it in depth. So with that, I'm going to bring a conclusion to today's broadcast. I would like to thank Megan Beats for joining me in the studio, as well as Benjamin Deniston and Dennis Small. And thank you for tuning in. Good night.